So, you've been assigned to teach public speaking. It's not essay writing, and it's not theater. We want to make the experience as beneficial for our students as possible. We want them to leave our classroom empowered, inspired, and confident in their skill sets. But who has the time to read research and go to workshops? That's where I come in. My name is Julian, and you're listening to the Public Speaking Educators Forum. This podcast is for educators who teach public speaking. Each week, you'll hear from a fellow instructor who has an interesting trick to the trade to share with you. We are speaking up so that you can help your students to speak up too. Tonight on the forum, we'll be speaking with Dr. Zen Falks, who is the author of Better Posters: Plan, Design, and Present an Academic Poster. He is on the faculty of the School of Interdisciplinary Science at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada, and has given a number of workshops and talks about poster presentation design. To view some of his work, you can visit his blog page at betterposters.blogspot.com. So, let's get started. How might one integrate poster presentations into the general education public speaking course? Because from my exposure to poster presentations, you see them at the undergraduate level, usually only in the upper level courses or perhaps in the STEM disciplines, but I've almost never seen it in a general education course. So how would you approach that?
I agree that posters are primarily a method of communication that you see in science and engineering, and you see it less commonly in other disciplines. How you could approach this into a general education course depends on what you're trying to achieve, but I think that the nice thing about a poster is that it allows you to integrate text, graphics, and speaking in a way that is different than a PowerPoint presentation and is in many ways a more challenging kind of presentation. In terms of the design, but it's, for many people, it's actually less stressful in terms of the presentation end. So it really works a different set of muscles, so to speak, in terms of your presentation skills. On the design side, I think posters are a more challenging format than a slide talk because you have limited space. And so it's very valuable to have students work within a limit. And sometimes you can enforce that with PowerPoint or in different kinds of ways, but just having, okay, you have to print this on a piece of paper. There's no escape from that. There's no sort of tricks where you can add in things or use animation or anything like that. It's a hard limit. And when you do that, I think really helps students. It can really force them to be concise and to really do the editorial work. Similarly, if you are talking to somebody in a poster session, this is not a situation like an oral presentation where there's one speaker at a time. Everybody is giving their presentation in parallel. So it's a lower stakes in the sense that nobody is feeling pressured that every eye is on the room with them. On the other hand, again, I think there's a challenging aspect to this, which is useful for students, in that you have to compete for attention. If you want to start a conversation with somebody, you are competing with all the other people who are doing interesting and cool things within the room. And I think those are aspects of a poster presentation that set them apart from a more traditional slide presentation. And so if you have students making slide presentations, giving oral presentations, there's no reason you can't have them do a poster presentation as well. And you can hit some of the same learning objectives, but again, you can sort of twist them around and have the students approach it in different and interesting ways, so that they don't get stuck on, well, this is the one way that I'm going to do all of my presentations from here on in.
And it's really interesting how different these modes of presentation are. I mean, I always consider a poster presentation to be more of an interpersonal exercise than a performance, like the way we think of one person standing up. I think it's amazing that people haven't really bought into that on the undergraduate level, because yes, we're trying to teach people presentation skills, but we also need to help them develop the interpersonal skills and be able to hold a conversation about research they've done or about something that they just know a lot about. And I think it's something that I feel like undergrads could probably do well at if they were given the opportunity to.
I absolutely agree with you. And one of the things I say quite frequently when I'm talking about posters is whoever starts the most conversations wins. That's usually sort of opposed to what I think a lot of people, when they are making poster, have in the back of their mind, which is whoever has the most information wins. And I'm always going, no. It's not about how much you can stuff on the poster. It's how many people you can talk to. It's how many people you can engage. And that conversational aspect is one of the real strengths of the poster format. And it really allows you to have that one-on-one interaction, or at least one to a few, and a back and forth, and a way that you don't get with an oral presentation. And a joke that I like to tell is the reason that poster presentations are better than an oral presentation is that when you give a poster presentation and there's somebody who is in the room, if you're talking to them, you know that they're not sitting in the back of the room checking their email. You're right in their face, and you can have that opportunity to sort of see their reaction and sort of gauge, wait, did I lose this person? Has his or her eyes glazed over? And maybe I can back up and try again and approach the topic from a different way so that I can maybe bring this person back on board with my main point.
And I think there's a lot to be gained from that, even though it's definitely more challenging when you think about it, because it's easy when you're in front of an audience, you can kind of move around the room, you can look at different people, whereas this is a very focused one-to-one type of communication, and definitely a very important learning experience for students to have. So you've kind of mentioned some of the things that you would look for if you were to teach this mode of presentation to students. But now let's kind of move in the other direction as far as looking at design, because it's not just about speaking, it's about the creation of a visual medium, the poster itself. And we can't really expect students who take public speaking to also have completed a course in graphic design or layout design, or however you like to call it. So how do you integrate those skills, and more importantly, how much or how little do we teach? Because we obviously don't want to deviate from teaching performance and teaching these human communication skills. So it's kind of it's a tall order, I guess you can say. So what are your thoughts on that?
In terms of how much graphic design should somebody get in a communication class, I think that they should get some, because while I 100% agree that there's too much emphasis on PowerPoint, nevertheless, for a lot of students, when they are giving presentations, very, very frequently, there's going to be some expectation that it is going to be accompanied by visuals. Not in every case, but certainly in many cases. And frequently what I'm having to do, because I have students typically in the sciences, because that's my background, that's what I teach, I'm having to sort of force them away from the PowerPoint. And I've quite often banned PowerPoint because it's like, I want you to focus on your narrative and your delivery and your speaking style, because it's too easy to get bound up with making the PowerPoint. Now, in terms of how much to bring in for just a beginning student, I think that there's a few elements that you can bring in that are not particularly overwhelming. And the nice thing about them is when you bring them in, they're not only applying to a poster, but some of those basic principles are going to apply to PowerPoint slides. And for that matter, they're also going to apply to documents that students will write as well. So some basic elements of typography, about things like, okay, how can you make text readable to somebody? What are some of the aspects that are going to enhance somebody's ability to quickly take away a message? This is something that cuts across all kinds of printed communication. And so I think that ties into these sorts of, as a general skill, I think that it's worth bringing in some of those basic concepts for typography, layout, and if somebody wants to get way deep into graphic design and data visualization, let them take a different course. But I think that you can introduce a few elements of communication, such as, for instance, reading order, right? I see a lot of posters where there's no clear reading order, and I have to tell people, look, if you're a skilled reader, where's the place you expect to start on a page? In the top left corner. Where do you expect to end up? In the bottom right corner. And I see a lot of posters where that's not the case, where people just sort of completely forget that readers have expectations. And I don't think that is a particularly difficult concept to get across. For a student. And so I think that there are those kinds of just basic visual elements, or thinking about hierarchy is another visual element. And you can relate that back to somebody thinking about, okay, when you are giving an oral presentation, how do you make a point? How do you emphasize something? Well, you do that by things like repetition. You can do that by things like making statements at the very beginning or the very end, where people really tend to notice that. And you can talk then about how you can take some of those and use those in a visual sense, and talk about, right, how do you emphasize something? Well, you can do the same sort of tricks. You can use size as an indicator of importance. You can use position. So again, you can put your main point at the beginning of the poster. You can put it at the end of the poster. So I think that these can be reinforcing of some of those visual elements, along with some of the general oral communication elements as well.
I agree. And I think in an age where we are a visual culture, I think in the 21st century more so than ever before, thanks to mobile devices and everything else. And I think that teaching sort of visual literacy in this context, I think, is very important, not just for public speaking, but also for other forms of message design and communication. So I think it's great that you are using this in this context. So changing gears a little bit, if you were to, let's put you in the consultant role for a second, and you're speaking to faculty members across other disciplines, not just the sciences, how would you recommend instructors integrate poster presentations, perhaps as a substitute for traditional presentations and speeches?
If you are in a situation where you have a class that has students who are giving multiple oral presentations, it's easy enough to simply swap one of those presentations with a poster presentation. Frequently in seminar classes I've taught, I ran into an issue early on where I realized I had students giving one presentation during a semester. And essentially, there were like 2 presentations a week. There was 13 to 15 weeks in the semester, and I had, a class of maybe pushing 30 students, So I realized that, I'm kind of forcing the students to be all their eggs in one basket. So I expanded that so that they gave 2 presentations. One was very short. It was 5 minutes. But and that helped solve the problem, that they had at least 2 kicks at the can for giving a presentation. In case they completely failed miserably on the first one, that they at least had a second one. And similarly, I think that one of the advantages of a poster session is that you can do something where you can have one day and you can see all of the posters a class makes and easily scan and evaluate them in that one day. Whereas if you were to try and have all of those students give a presentation orally, that is going to take up an enormous amount of time. And it's not really feasible in some cases to add in another presentation. And so I think that is one possible use of a poster presentation is in a class where maybe a student doesn't have too many opportunities to show their stuff in an oral presentation. It gives them an opportunity to show their work, again, using some slightly different techniques. It gives them an opportunity to show their work in another light so that they're spreading out their how they're being assessed a little bit. And it's not so much as riding on a single presentation. It becomes a little less high stakes.
And at the same time, you're giving them more opportunity or more floor time or stage time, however you'd like to call it, because that's
more
one
opportunities to practice. Yeah.
And that's something that's just such a struggle when you teach a class where there is a speaking component to the grade is time. I mean, we'd love to give our students lots and lots of opportunities to speak, but there's only so many weeks or so many months in the semester, so many hours for the class. And how do you do that and then juggle with the lecture and the instruction? So it's interesting that you consider that as well, the time to administer and assess those assignments. And I think sometimes we design assignments and then we think, oh, wow, now I have to give this out and grade it too.
This has been the curse of my existence this semester. I developed some assessments which they were the right assessments to give, but I didn't realize, they really rack up there, which means I have to write them all. I have to write all the rubrics. I have to do all these things. But the semester's almost over, fortunately. So end of tangent.
It's a tangent we can all empathize with, I assure you. So the last question I'll ask, if we can we'll take this out to campus-wide level. So
right.
Every now and then you'll see college campuses will host faculty research poster sessions or symposia, and even you'll see them do it with students as well, and I think that's wonderful. So how would you go about putting an event like that together? Not a stand up and speak type of situation, but specifically a poster session.
Organizing a poster session has a few elements to it. The first is making sure that you have an appropriate physical space. And one of the things that I have seen sometimes is there's a trend for people to, especially in the sort of larger professional conferences, the trend has been to make posters smaller, and this causes all kinds of problems. And I've seen posters that have been mounted on top of each other so that one is like way above the heads of people and there's no possible way to read it. I've seen situations where posters are mounted one on top of each other, but the bottom poster is basically at crotch height, which is extremely socially awkward. And I've seen poster sessions outdoors, which is just asking for the gods of weather to laugh at you and bring in a sudden unexpected downpour. I've seen posters mounted on tripods, which are, have these, all the feet are sort of in the way and crammed up. I've seen posters mounted on stairwells, all of these sorts of things. And it's like, no, you have to pick the right physical location with enough square footage in front of each poster, which is, people tend to underestimate just how much space you need for that square footage. And it's really, if you don't have enough space, it really becomes an accessibility issue for wheelchair users, for instance. And just, it makes a very uncomfortable experience, which is not what you want. So that's the first element of this. The second element is on the organizational side, where you have to put out a call for abstracts. You have to, and try to gauge how many people actually want to give posters. And usually you ask for a title and an abstract and who's going to be presenting. So that way you can, again, gauge what kind of space you need. Do I have enough poster boards? And so forth. The other thing that you need to do at that point is to try to see how you want to organize them. And typically poster sessions are created so that related topics are together. Now, that has pros and cons, because quite frequently people say, well, if all the related topics are together, I'm giving out my poster at the same time as somebody else whose poster I might want to see. But I think that for the viewer, having related posters together is very, very valuable. And also for the presenter, it can be valuable as well, because sometimes you can be right next to somebody, and if you're not presenting, you can at least strike up a conversation with the persons who have posters on either side of you or across from you, in sort of down periods where there's nobody who is talking to you individually. And honestly, at that point, you've done most of the work. Most of the work is done, well before the event begins. During the event, there's only a few things that you need to be taking care of, which are primarily that you have enough supplies for people to mount the poster boards. Depending on the size, you might want to have a few things available, like make sure that there's some sort of water available. You might maybe some chairs available for people who have trouble standing, and possibly, just have some people just around to be helpful to people to put up their posters or to guide people to particular posters. But even that, in a lot of cases, for a small institutional poster session, you wouldn't need something like that. That would already be effectively there and available to you. So it's not particularly difficult if you just have to think of the right few things up at the front. When you start talking about a professional meeting, obviously then you have more issues around, you have more people, you have more problems and so forth. But really, for a small institutional poster session, you really just need to think about the physical space and getting an idea of how many people want to present, and just doing a little bit of organization for that. So it's not a particularly time-consuming task necessarily.
Well, that's really good to hear. And I think that this is probably a good place for us to stop. So please let me say thank you, Dr. Faulkes, for all of your advice. And of course, thank you all for listening to this week's edition of the Public Speaking Educators Forum. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and Google Play. Follow us on Twitter at PSEF Podcast. And be sure to tune in again real soon.